There are some little songs that just stick in your head. I'm going to have Joe channel me here. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Little things like that. You know them even if it's been years since you sang it as a child or sang it to your own child or your own grandchild. And there's a song in my head that I haven't thought of much in the past 50 years, but recent events brought it to mind, and I think you'll understand why. Here's the first line. If you miss me at the back of the bus and you can't find me nowhere, come on up to the front of the bus. I'll be riding up there. And then the second stanza begins with these words. If you miss me at the swimming hole and you can't find me nowhere, come on over to the swimming pool. I'll be swimming over there. Now, as you can probably guess, this was a song from the 1960s civil rights struggle. I first heard it 50 years ago this past March 25th weekend. It was 1965, and it was the spring of my sophomore year of college at the University of Missouri in Columbia. The Bloody Sunday Voters' Rights March in Selma, Alabama, had happened several weeks before that weekend. I heard about it and went to an organizational meeting that was sponsored by Dr. Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, abbreviated as SCLC, or pronounced SLIC for short. And there weren't many people there. There was just a handful. It was in some church in downtown Columbia. But they talked about doing something to support the Selma marchers who had been brutally beaten by police and residents of Selma. I took the message back to the Newman Center at Missouri University, and after overcoming his skepticism, the priest who was director there allowed me to put something in the bulletin about this initiative to see if anybody was interested. And as I recall, no one else seemed much interested. Nobody came. And I don't remember how this happened, but somehow I hooked up with a group of students from Washington University who were bound for Montgomery, Alabama for the March 25th rally on the state capitol steps. So I got on one of three big buses right out here in Forsyth, a block or so up the road, and we were off to the deep south. I think it was maybe a Friday night, I can't remember exactly. Now we joined, I don't know, it was tens of thousands or maybe several 100,000 people who came from near and far to support the African Americans in the South who had the audacity to want to vote. And we were called outside agitators, and we were proud to carry that title. I don't have time to share with you what happened on that weekend 50 years ago, but I can tell you that it really changed me. It was the first time that I experienced segregation in all its ugliness. I was, of course, aware of the famous bus boycott in that very city of Montgomery, where Rosa Parks was arrested for daring to sit in the front of the bus instead of in the back in what they called the colored seats. But I somehow thought that had all changed after the 381-day-long bus boycott that was lifted when the city changed its law following a U.S. Supreme Court decision that found such laws unconstitutional. I didn't know in 1965 that people of color could still not eat at the same lunch counter as white people, that they couldn't drink from the same public drinking fountains, and that they had to sit in a separate waiting room at the bus station in Memphis, where we made our first stop, I guess, to change drivers on the way down to Montgomery. And I literally couldn't believe my own eyes. And the next day, I was unprepared for the hateful stares that we got from the white office workers who leaned out the office buildings along the broad avenue going up to the state capitol building. I was unprepared to see how one group of human beings could exclude another group of human beings for so many things that I, as a member of a privileged class, not even knowing I was, but I was, that I just took for granted. And as the day of the march drew to a close, people were sort of dispersing. We on the three WashU buses were among the last and maybe the last group to leave town. And we had heard a rumor that one of the protesters had been killed. And we later learned that she was a 39-year-old mother of 5 from Detroit. She was a white woman, and she was a member of the NAACP. Her name was Viola Luiso, and she was a nursing student at Wayne State University. And I cut this article out of the Post-Dispatch, 22nd of March, and I learned that the Wayne State University was going to award her an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. That was the first posthumous award in the 145-year-old school history, because they didn't do that, but this year they did. Well, when we heard the rumor of her murder, we saw the Alabama National Guard troops leaving town. They had been federalized to protect the demonstrators. And we saw them getting on they're called deuce-and-a-half trucks for those of you who are in the Army, and they were rolling out of town. And we waved to these soldiers, looking at them as our protectors. Only they weren't. They were all white men, they were National Guard reservists, and they were all from Alabama. And we got the point when our friendly waves were returned with the finger. The one-finger salute, as we called it back then. If you miss me at the back of the bus and you can't find me nowhere, come on up to the front of the bus. I'll be riding up there. Now, on this second Sunday of Easter, on this Sunday called Divine Mercy Sunday, we continue to celebrate the excluded one, the Jesus of Nazareth, who dared to preach inclusion of all peoples, regardless of their religion, their race, their nationality, their gender, their social status, and if he were here today, he would say their sexual orientation. It was this Jesus who made it a point to befriend the friendless, to associate with the outcast. He reached out to the leper, the prostitute, the hated collaborators who collected the Roman taxes, the publicans, the Samaritans, the sinners, all the outcast. And they killed him in repayment for his kindness. With his death outside the city walls, it was thought by those in power that they'd finally won. They had killed this man who challenged the system, but God always has the last word. God raised up Jesus and made of him a new creation. And in being raised from the dead, Jesus became what the early church would eventually call, and it's recorded in 1 Corinthians, the first fruits of those who had fallen asleep. The cosmic Christ who triumphed over death itself and who lives and reigns at the right hand of God, the Father of all. Jesus' march from Jerusalem to Calvary may be the most important civil rights march of all time, culminating not just in a rally of thousands of people, but in the liberation of all from the greatest chains known to humankind, the chains of death. And it's abundantly clear in what we know of Jesus that this freedom from death is available not just to the so-called elect, but to all. And since it also seems abundantly clear that God works in partnership with us to build up the kingdom of heaven on earth, we human beings who are infused with God's divine life at our baptism, the question arises, what do I do that excludes others? What should I do to include others? The American poet Charles Markham penned a short little poem entitled Outwitted. Like the civil rights songs I learned years ago, this poem I first read in college has stuck with me. He drew a circle to keep me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. I've lately been asking myself, what is it that I do to exclude others, and as well as what can I do to change that in myself? And I've concluded that most of the exclusion I do of others takes place internally, in my own head and in my own heart. Mary and I chose to live in a multicultural, racially integrated neighborhood all our lives. Mary and I sent our kids to integrated schools. We have many friends from many different lands, cultures, and races. I guess I've always seen myself as a person who doesn't exclude others, and I think that's a fair self-assessment. But with a deeper analysis, I'm not so sure that I'm the inclusive person I'd like to be. Certainly not the inclusive person God calls me to be. Now, I say this because of my growing awareness of how much I compare myself to others. It's such an automatic process that I don't even know that I'm doing it. Another poem, favorite poem of mine, Desiderata by Max Ehrmann, puts it this way. If you compare yourself with others, you may become vain and bitter. For always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. Now, when I compare myself to others who in some way I think are better than me, I guess it does make me feel bitter in some way, or bad about myself, at least in some way. And if I compare myself to others who I think are in some way less than me, it feeds my vanity. And both thinking of myself as worse than or better than other people results in my excluding myself from them or excluding them from me. And that's not a pretty thing. And while I look pretty tolerant on the outside, I have to admit that my insides don't always match my outside. In our first reading from the Acts of the Apostles today, we hear, quote, "The community of believers was of one mind and heart." Of course, they had differences one from another, and they, being human like us, some of them probably excluded those whom they judged to be non-believers. But at least they tried to be of one heart and mind. And can we say the same about ourselves? And we, like those early Christians mentioned in the second reading from the letter of John, we confess on this second Sunday of Easter that we believe that Jesus is the Christ. And because of that, that makes us all begotten by God. The text reads, begotten by God. It reads, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is begotten by God. It reads, in this way we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. For the love of God is this, that we keep his commandments. And you all know what Jesus said about the commandments when asked what's the greatest commandment. You know that he said it's to love God with your whole mind, your whole heart. And then he said the second commandment is like it, that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. So the question is there any room for exclusion of those of us who say that we love God with our whole heart and that we love others as much as we love ourselves? If there is, that's an inherent contradiction. I can't love God and not also love those whom God has created in his own image as his sons and daughters, all beloved beyond measure. Now, Pope Francis taught us a lesson in inclusivity by his actions this Holy Thursday and the previous one. The usual way of enacting the washing of the apostles' feet by Jesus is to have a priest wash the feet of 12 men. And I know of a parish in our archdiocese a few years ago when a young priest insisted that the women already chosen for the feet washing be replaced by men. Not much of a demonstration of inclusivity, is it? Nor of judgment on my part. This stuff freaks you out when you take it too seriously. Wow. Pope Francis, on the other hand, washed the feet of 6 women from a detention center and 6 men from a prison. And the Pope meets frequently with inmates and recently had lunch in Naples with gay and transgender prisoners. I don't see them welcome very much in our churches. Can we dare to believe that the rigidity that sometimes seems to strangle our politics and our church give way to the inclusiveness of the Pope and the inclusiveness of Jesus? Can we be saved from the exclusion of others that we do that comes so easy to us? Or is it that we were like Thomas, who refused to believe that the peace that Jesus announced in his resurrection was now a reality? Do we really believe that? Or will we instead enter into the suffering of the world, including the exclusion of others, through the wounds of our crucified Lord, and come to experience and believe that the peace and unity, you hear that in Mass, the peace and unity of God's kingdom is indeed a reality that's freely given and is there to be embraced by all, with no one excluded. He drew a circle to keep me out. heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in.